Hi, and welcome to PIIE Insider Live. I'm Anjali Bhatt. I'm a research fellow and the communications manager here at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. I often say that one of the best parts of my job here at PIIE is that I can just walk into the office of some of the world's top economists and just ask them anything, and then they answer. So with PIIE Insider Live, you get to come with me to ask those questions and get those answers. Today, we're speaking with economics legend and PIIE senior fellow, Olivier Blanchard. We'll be discussing his recent PIIE piece titled, How Will Trumponomics Work Out? And why he thinks that Trump will be disappointed by the results of some of his economic policies, but it won't be the catastrophe that some economists claim. There will be time for questions towards the end, so go ahead and submit those via the Q&A box function. Please don't raise your hand, just use the text Q&A box. And also please make sure that your name is visible and included in those questions. So, hi, Olivier. Nice to see you back in DC.
Nice to be here.
Yeah.
Thanks for the nice words.
You are a legend. So, I mean, you lived in the US for a long time in all of your various roles, and then you moved back to France a couple years ago. What's it like being back now, especially just after the election?
So I think you have to realize that for the last year, the whole world has been following the Trump saga. So I have a sense in which I never left. Even although the politics in France are complex as well. Really, we have all basically lived with the campaign and then the outcome. So no, I never left. My body left, but my mind has stayed.
You can't escape America.
Something like that.
So, okay, let's talk about Trumponomics. Broadly, Trumponomics is high tariffs, tax cuts, and deregulation for businesses, and mass deportations of immigrants, among some other policies. We're going to go through each of those individually, but broadly, this suite of economic policies, given the US economy right now, is Trumponomics going to make much of a difference?
So I think you really have to separate between two parts. The first one is what would have happened without Trump. And the fact is the US economy is in very good shape. The voters may not have concluded that, but if you look at unemployment, you look at growth, the Biden administration is really giving the Trump administration a very nice gift. Now, how is Trumponomics is going to change that? It's probably going to lead to a bit more overheating, a very strong economy, and probably a bit more inflation. There are many other dimensions, but if I had to summarize, I would say these are the two.
Okay. What is overheating?
Overheating is basically when the economy is going too strong, right?
So why is that bad?
Why is that bad? Because it creates pressure and it leads to inflation, which is bad. So the analogy is to a car. Right? I mean, you want the car to run fast, but not faster than that, because at some stage something will break. Yeah. And we don't know exactly where it is, but at this stage, the US economy is probably where it should be, right? Unemployment is at 4%, growth is good. Pushing it a lot would lead to inflation and various other things, which would probably not be so good.
I think the car analogy really helps there for overheating. Okay, so let's break this down a little bit. So in the piece that you wrote when we're talking about tariffs, you said that if the tariffs are implemented, and when we say tariffs, we mean broadly a 10 to 20% tariff on all imports to the US, as well as a 60% tariff on imports from China. And so let's say all of those are implemented. You say that the initial good news on trade and output fronts may last through to the 2026 midterm elections, but will then fade away. So what are those improvements on trade and output, and then why will they fizzle away in about 2-ish years?
So I think the first issue before we discuss what they would do is whether they will be implemented.
Yeah, that's the question.
And there is a discussion as to whether this is just an opening gambit in order to get things from the Europeans or the Chinese, and they will not happen. My best guess is that they will happen. So under that assumption, then your question comes in. At the beginning, when you put the tariff, then Chinese, in particular, Chinese imports to the US are going to come down. People are going to shift to domestic goods. So the trade deficit is going to be reduced because we're buying less from the Chinese, but there's going to be more demand because people were buying Chinese goods. They now buy US goods, right? So you basically get these two effects. You get a decrease in trade deficit, you get a stronger economy, and that's not so bad, right? The problem is that it doesn't last.
Okay.
Right.
Why?
Why? And then history, we've had so many experiments that we can be fairly confident. So two things can happen. The first one is the Chinese and the Europeans may not play nice, right? They may say, okay, you put tariffs, well, we do the same, or we do worse, right? In which case, well, then it becomes a commercial war and we cannot export anymore, right? And so the result is much less attractive. It's basically higher tariffs on both sides. Less overheating, less inflation, but not much result. And the trade deficit just goes back to where it was, right?
And so growth would slow down too then.
Yeah, we basically, both sides increasing the tariffs and not much effect on the trade deficit, on the economy, on inflation, but a waste. I mean, right? Higher prices for everybody. Even if there is no retaliation, then typically two things can happen. Well, first one is tariffs reduce the trade deficit initially. So markets, when they have to decide what the dollar is worth, say, well, the dollar should be stronger because now we have less of a trade deficit. Now that sounds good, but it makes life harder for exporters, right? Because they're less competitive. So
their stuff is more expensive.
Exactly. You're winning on the import side, but you're losing on the export side. So the result is the trade deficit doesn't look so good. And then if you have overheating and you have inflation, the job of the Fed is to say, we don't like inflation, right? So let's increase rates. When you increase rates, US rates, right? Well, you're an investor and you have a choice between, buying bonds in Europe or buying bonds in the US. You're going to go to the US. So you're going to get a dollar appreciation. And so at the end, basically, you get the same trade deficit. You don't have overheating if the Fed has reacted. Not much has happened.
The stuff is just more expensive.
And if you think longer run, then there are good reasons why we have international trade. It's comparative advantage. So in the long run, there's a loss. But I think the profile is for the first year or two, looks good. Then it looks less good. And then we go back to where we were.
Okay, so tariffs are good for 2 years, maybe.
Well, they're good in the sense of, of increasing output, but that's not necessarily desirable. It's like running your car too fast.
Yeah.
So let's be careful about good. And they are good in the sense that they may increase growth, but sometimes too much growth is dangerous.
And it won't last.
Right.
Okay, so that's tariffs. Let's turn to immigration. So there have been many numbers that have been thrown around about how many immigrants the Trump administration aims to deport, which is bad in general. The numbers generally range in the millions, but you say that you assume that the deportations will be in the tens or hundreds of thousands rather than the millions. And if it were millions, it would be catastrophic, but that's not going to happen. So why do you say that?
You've said everything I was going to say. No, but you have it right. The numbers, if the Trump administration really goes through with what they have said, it's between 11 and 15 million, right? Impossible to do over 4 years anyway. So their plan is maybe 1 million a year. 1 million a year would be a reduction of a US labor force of half a percent per year. So over 4 years, it would basically be, or 5 years, it would basically be, if they do the whole thing, let me just get the number right. If they were to expel 11 million, then basically the labor force would be reduced by 5%. That's an enormous number. Now, what would happen is that it would not happen because as soon as we start doing this, the firms, the people who employ these immigrants, most of them are working, about 8 million out of 11, right? Would start calling the White House if they get the number and say, look, we can't find people to do what is needed in agriculture, in restaurants and so on. So I think there would be enormous pressure. And then the labor market would be so tight that you'd have to basically attract, US workers. You'd have to increase wages. It would create inflation. So I'm fairly confident that it will not happen. So my best guess is they'll do a lot at the beginning, symbolic, right? Buses going back to the border, planes and so on. But at the end, it may be more of the order of 100,000 or 200,000. I don't know exactly the number, but something which from a macroeconomic point of view is not catastrophic. From a human point of view is surely catastrophic for these people. The other thing to say is that maybe the symbolic aspect, the buses and so on, may actually deter people from wanting to come. So while we may not be able to reduce the stock very much, it may be that we slow down the flow a lot, which would be, from the point of view of administration, a success. But in macroeconomic terms, I think this will go nowhere.
So the stock is the amount of people who are here now, and then the flow is
The
going,
flow is the people
coming in and out.
Now, if we could, and I think we all agree that we should try to slow down the flow, right? I think that's generally agreed. This is one way of doing it, which is that you're very tough on the people who are here. Even if you don't deport millions, you basically show the people that are thinking of coming that it's probably not a good place.
Yeah.
That might work.
Okay. Wow, we have so many questions coming in. Okay. Let's turn to taxes and the budget, which we're getting a couple questions on. So the Trump administration wants to extend the 2017 tax cuts. That would increase the federal budget deficit and the debt ratio. Walk me through why that's bad.
Well, deficits mean, when they are large, means that debt increases. And if it keeps increasing, at some point, you cannot pay it back. And the US is now in a position where, even before Trump, the deficit is extremely large. This would make it worse and accelerate basically the increase in the debt. So at some point, and we really don't know when, investors would start saying, are we going to be paid back? When they do this, that has happened in many countries at many times, they say, okay, no, I mean, we're not sure, so I'm going to ask for a higher interest rate. But the higher interest rate makes things worse because then you have to pay even more. And then there's a loop, right? A vicious loop, which leads sometimes to default. Now, this has happened in many other countries, and it's kind of inconceivable in the US, but is it really inconceivable is the question. My sense is that investors are probably not going to be terrified right away, but maybe we'll see some indication of worries in the bond market.
They might get nervous.
And this means higher rates for the 10-year treasuries, for example. So I think that's an issue. The other question is, what does it do to the macroeconomy? Leaving this aside, right? And that's actually complicated. So there are two parts. I think what's going to happen nearly for sure is the extension of the 2017 tax cuts, but that's going to make the deficit worse relative to what it would have been if they hadn't been extended. But I think people have assumed it was going to happen. So we're not going to spend much more. So the effect on demand, on the activity may be weak because basically they have always assumed it would happen. There is more, right? He's promised to, or at least he has indicated that he would cut taxes on social security benefits, cut taxes on tips, and that he would decrease the corporate tax rate further, at least for manufacturing firms. Now, these will add to the deficit, but they will also add to demand. I mean, if you're a social security recipient and you don't have to pay taxes, you're going to spend more. So this has the potential of leading to overheating. And we've defined it earlier. And,
now we know what it means.
In the podcast, so I don't need to do it again, but you can see people would spend more in an economy which really cannot take it. So it might lead to more inflation. So on this, I think the main issue is that the US should be thinking about reducing the deficit, quite apart from Trump. Trump is probably going to make it worse. In terms of macroeconomic implications, it's probably going to put some overheating, some inflation, and then again force the Fed to say, well, if there's inflation, we have to do our job.
Okay, we'll get to the Fed in 1 second. I just want to chase one thing. The taxes on tips, that was a big thing in the campaign, on both sides. And so many people were like, yeah, that sounds great. And so many economists were like, no, it's not. And is part of it because of this overheating issue?
No, it's but it tips are income,
Mm.
and there is no reason why you should not tax that income. And if you start doing this, you'll see more and more of salary being paid in tips,
Yeah.
right? And so now this is just, I mean, I understand for the people who receive tips, it's a very good news. But from an economic point of view, we have to be fair. We have to tax taxpayers in a fair way, and excluding tips doesn't seem like a fair thing to do.
Okay, that makes sense. So another thing, besides cutting the corporate tax rate, another part of Trumponomics is deregulation, sort of broadly. Businesses generally tend to think deregulation is good. Is that not the case here?
Business typically thinks that they should be less regulated, but there's a reason why there's regulation, which we don't want to let business do exactly what it wants. I think that there are risks of deregulation, especially in the financial system. We've learned a lot from the great financial crisis. And we've learned that we have to make sure that banks can resist when people take their money out or some loans go bad. We have capital ratio requirements. We have liquidity ratio requirements, which are just forcing banks to be able to function even if things go bad. This is precious. We need
that.
we don't want the great financial crisis to happen again. I think there is a risk that banks succeed in making these requirements less tough, and this will increase the risk. Another dimension in which I worry is crypto. Now, crypto has contributed to the campaign a lot, and I think has convinced Trump that crypto was good. Crypto is no good, and if it's not regulated, it can do very bad things, and I worry about this. I don't think it's macro relevant because of our crypto is big, it's not enormous, but that's one thing I worry about.
That's a soundbite right there. All right, let's turn. We've mentioned now the Fed a couple times, and a lot of this hinges on it not being a catastrophe if the Fed does its job. And so the Fed's job is maximum employment and price stability, and interest rates are the tools that they use to do that. So why do you think that the Fed will do its job, and what would happen if they don't?
So I think the issue for the Fed is either tariffs lead to more overheating, deportation leads to a very tight labor market, wage inflation, price inflation, then lower taxes lead. So there are three reasons to think that the Fed might basically see higher inflation. We don't know how much, but to the extent it does, then the job of the Fed is to prevent it, or at least to stop it when it comes. How does it do it? The old-fashioned way. It increases interest rates, right? Which means higher interest rates, stronger dollar, because again, investors like high interest rates and they come. And so the assumption is that if the Fed does what it has to do, it will stand in the way of what the Trump administration wants. Will it do it? Yes, I'm quite convinced that at least as long as Jay Powell is chair, which is 2026, he will stand firm. He has been very clear that the mandate of the Fed is to make sure that inflation doesn't go up, or if it does, that it comes down, and that he was going to stay as chair. He has been very explicit about it.
He has been very clear about that.
So I think until then, we're safe. Now, there's a scenario in which, his term as chair, not as member of the board of governors, but as chair, ends, and he's replaced by somebody who is willing to do Trump's job. Now, what does it mean? That means keeping interest rates low, right? And letting inflation increase. So if this happened, then we might have very strong inflation, right? And that's undesirable. Is it likely to happen? My guess is no, because even if he were to succeed in putting in place, in nominating somebody with his ideas, the decision is a decision of a board of the FOMC. And my impression is that the majority will stick to the mandate. But I think the risk of a conflict between the Trump administration and the Fed is very high.
Would that if there's a conflict, and I mean, even last term, Trump, was saying things about the Fed. If there is that conflict, how would that affect markets?
Well, if he succeeds in basically removing Powell through other means in ways I've not thought about, and I cannot think, but then markets would be terrified. If he puts somebody through the channels I've talked about who is willing to not increase interest rates, this would put into question something that we have spent decades building, which is central bank independence, credibility of monetary policy. This would be potentially extremely costly. It might lead investors to question the dollar, to question treasuries, to question. So I think this would be a major upheaval. And when he understands what may happen, he may want to not to do it.
Yeah, let's hope so. Okay, we have a couple questions here, both about the tariffs and the tax cuts. Where do tariff revenues play into the budget deficit? And then where do the tax cuts play into the Fed's outlook?
Okay, so the tariffs, if they work, bring no revenues. Right?
Oh, okay.
You understand why?
Oh, yeah.
If you put a tariff on Chinese goods and there are no imports of Chinese goods, then
The point is to get people to stop importing.
Whatever tax rate you've put. Okay. The other is the tariffs yield a lot of revenues, right? I mean, on 60% on Chinese imports to the US is about 300 billion, I think. That's a lot, but that means it has not worked at all.
Because people are still buying things.
Right? Because Chinese imports are just the same as before. And as has been explained many times, it's not the Chinese paying, it is the US consumers and the US importers who pay. So you can't have both. And I don't know how he reconciles this in his mind, but you can't have both. You're going to be somewhere in between. And it's true that you're going to get some revenue from the tariffs, not enough to make a major difference to the deficit, but it is not negligible. So in that sense, yes, this will, other things equal, decrease the deficit a bit.
And then the
question,
tax cuts and the Fed's outlook.
Well, I mean, I think we've talked about this, but I can just restate it, which is if the tax cuts lead people to spend more, or if a corporate tax cut is decreased and firms invest more, this will lead to stronger demand. It will lead to overheating. It will lead to inflation. It will lead the Fed to react. The thing that I would add, I forgot to say it. I mean, there's this guy called Elon Musk, which you may have heard about, and he says that he can find 2 trillion of saving. Now, if we could do this, then we don't have a deficit problem, we have a surplus problem, and we don't know what to do with it. Okay, so the question is, how realistic is this new department or informal department, DOGE, going to be? There has been many attempts in the past, maybe not by people like Elon Musk, but people who knew the institutions, the details, the granularity of it, to try to see how much it could be reduced. And what you find is behind every bit of spending, there's probably a senator with a view, right? And then even if there's no senator, it's very difficult to just remove, hundreds of thousands of public employees, which is what this would require. So I think this might make a small difference.
Okay.
And I'm all in favor of trying to get the administration to be more efficient. But in terms of numbers, the notion that this is going to eliminate the deficit, I think is not at all realistic.
Let's see. Okay, so let's turn to the rest of the world. We have a question here from Eduardo Jimenez. How do you think Trump's policies will affect Mexico and the rest of Latin America?
I think that they can affect Mexico very much. I mean, deportations with a major impact. Not all the undocumented immigrants come from Mexico, but many do. There is the issue of whether Mexico can continue to export to the US. There is the issue of if Mexico in producing has any element in it which is Chinese made, whether this will be allowed in the US. So I think it really forces Mexico to think very hard about how it's going to behave. I think other countries, we've been talking about Trumponomics on the US. I don't think it's great, but there are countries for which it's going to be incredibly tough because they have to decide how do we deal with how do we reorganize our economy to basically deal with the tariffs? So, are the U.S. firms going to come to Mexico if they cannot export back to the U.S.? You've taken Mexico, but it's true of many countries. Many countries are going to have to decide which side they're on. If the Trump tariffs lead to a commercial war between China and the US, each country will have to decide who am I friends with. And if China and the US are tough, you cannot be friends with both, which means that the kind of supply chain that you want to be in, you have to decide which one you're in, and then the one you're in may no longer work. So I think there's going to be a number of countries, Vietnam, for example, Cambodia. I'm going out of Latin America here, but
it still applies.
I think for emerging markets, it's going to be a very tough environment. In addition, many of these countries have borrowed and they have dollar debt typically because they cannot issue in their own currency. So if the dollar is strong, which is likely, if interest rates are high, which is not unlikely, then the debt burden, which was already very high for a number of countries, is going to be bigger. So I think the issue is going to be the potential debt default and debt restructuring for a fairly large number of countries. These might be the worst victims, if you want, of these measures.
Okay. We are almost at time, and I will send you all of these questions if you want to answer them on Twitter or something. So I guess as we reach the end of our time here, when you go back to France, for the next sort of year or so, what will you be watching for in the Trump administration and in the US economy?
Well, first, I'm going to spend most of my time trying to deal with a French budget.
And that's a whole other episode.
We could do another 30 minutes on that. To the extent that I continue to watch what happens in the US, and I will, I think that I'm going to see whether my forecasts, which I make with great humility because there's so much uncertainty that, it could go one way. Something we didn't talk about, for example, is there's a lot of uncertainty, political uncertainty and therefore economic uncertainty. Could it be that my prediction or my forecast of overheating is wrong because firms are going to be paralyzed and are not going to invest? So it's a possibility. So I'm basically going to see whether my forecasts turn out to be right. And almost surely they will turn out to be partly right and partly wrong. And sometimes, some days I'll be happy and some days I will not.
Spoken like a true economist, it depends.
No. I want to go beyond that. I don't want to be a two-handed economist, and I've been fairly strong in my forecast, but they could well be wrong.
The uncertainty point, I think, also makes a lot of sense. Is that we just don't know.
Okay.
Okay, so we are at time here. Olivier, thank you so much for walking us through your thoughts on Trumponomics.
Thank you.
We will also be watching over the next year to see how your predictions play out. And thank you to all of you for joining us for this edition of PIIE Insider Live. What did you think? What do you want to see next? Let us know at meetings@PIIE.com. And if you're not already, subscribe to PIIE Insider, the newsletter, at PIIE.com/subscribe. So thank you again, and we hope you'll join us next time.